Let us begin our journey tonight by traveling back in time, to the late 15th century, to a world that was on the very precipice of a great and profound transformation. Imagine the world as it was known to the people of Europe at that time. It was a small and familiar space, a world of ancient kingdoms, of bustling trade routes that crisscrossed the Mediterranean Sea, and of a single, great landmass that stretched from the shores of Portugal all the way to the distant and mysterious lands of Cathay, or China. But beyond the edges of their maps, beyond the familiar and comforting sight of the land, lay a vast and terrifying mystery. The great Atlantic Ocean, which they called the Sea of Darkness, was a place of immense and unknown peril, a great, empty void that was populated in their imaginations not by new continents, but by monstrous sea serpents, by boiling seas, and by great, terrifying waterfalls that cascaded off the very edge of the world. For centuries, sailors had clung to the coastlines, their small and fragile ships rarely daring to venture out of the sight of land. The horizon was not a promise, it was a warning. But in the bustling port cities of Europe, in places like Lisbon and Seville, a new and restless spirit was beginning to stir. Can you picture it? The air in these cities was thick with the scent of sea salt, of drying ropes, and of the exotic spices that had traveled for thousands of miles along the ancient land routes from the east. The taverns were filled with sailors from all across the known world, their voices a low murmur of different languages, sharing quiet and fantastic tales of distant lands and of strange and wonderful peoples. And on the docks, a new kind of ship was being built, a ship that was small, but sturdy, and was designed not just to hug the coast, but to brave the open ocean. A great change was coming, a change that was fueled by a powerful combination of new ideas, of new technologies, and of a burning, insatiable desire to see what lay beyond that distant and mysterious horizon. What was driving this new and daring spirit? It was, in part, the great intellectual awakening of the Renaissance, a time when the people of Europe began to look at the world with a new sense of curiosity and of wonder. But it was also driven by a powerful economic necessity. In the year 1453, the great city of Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks, an event that had effectively cut off the ancient, overland trade routes to the east, the famous Silk Road. The valuable spices, the beautiful silks, and the other precious goods from India and from China now became incredibly rare and prohibitively expensive. The great kingdoms of Europe, particularly Portugal and Spain, knew that if they were to continue to prosper, they had to find a new way to reach the riches of the East, an all-sea route that would bypass the lands that were now controlled by their rivals. And it was a series of remarkable new technologies that would finally give them the tools and the courage they needed to undertake such a perilous and uncertain journey. The first of these was a new kind of ship, the caravel. It was a small, light, and incredibly maneuverable vessel, with a unique combination of square and triangular, or lateen, sails that, for the very first time, allowed a ship to sail effectively against the wind. This single innovation freed the sailors from their long dependence on the prevailing winds and allowed them to explore in directions that had previously been impossible. And they were armed with two other almost magical new tools. The first was the magnetic compass, a simple and yet profound invention, a small, magnetized needle that always pointed north, giving the sailors a constant and reliable sense of direction, even on the most overcast of days. The second was the astrolabe, a beautiful and intricate brass instrument that allowed them to measure the height of the sun and the stars above the horizon, and from that, to calculate their latitude, their position north or south on the great, open ocean. These new technologies, the caravel, the compass, and the astrolabe, were more than just tools, they were a great and powerful psychological boost. They gave the sailors of this new age the confidence they needed to finally turn their backs on the familiar and comforting sight of the land and to sail out into the vast and empty sea, with only their own courage and the lonely, distant stars to guide them. And so, in the bustling ports of Europe, a new kind of dream was being born, a dream of a world that was much larger, much stranger, and much more wonderful than anyone had ever imagined. It was a dream that would call to a new generation of brave and ambitious men, to explorers, and to adventurers who were willing to risk everything for a chance at glory, at wealth, or simply to be the very first to see what lay beyond the edge of the map. The age of the Great Navigators, the age of the lonely stars, was about to begin. The great ships that were being built in the bustling ports of 15th century Europe were more than just simple vehicles. They were self-contained worlds, intricate and beautiful machines of wood, of rope, and of canvas, each one a testament to the incredible skill and the growing ambition of their creators. And at the very heart of this new age of exploration was a revolutionary new kind of ship, the caravel. The caravel was not a massive or an imposing vessel like the great warships of later centuries. It was relatively small, often no more than 65 feet long, but it was incredibly sturdy, its hull deep and rounded, designed to withstand the powerful and unpredictable waves of the open ocean. But its true genius lay in its unique and sophisticated rigging. The caravel was equipped with a combination of traditional, square sails, which were perfect for running before the wind, and new, triangular, or lateen, sails, an innovation that had been borrowed from the Arab sailors of the Mediterranean. These lateen sails gave the caravel the remarkable and unprecedented ability to sail much closer to the wind, allowing it to make progress even when the winds were not favorable. This single innovation was a great and powerful liberation, freeing the sailors from the tyranny of the prevailing winds and opening up the entire ocean to their exploration. Let us now step aboard one of these magnificent vessels as she lies at anchor in the harbor, just days before her great voyage is set to begin. The first thing you notice is the sound, a quiet and constant symphony of the sea. There is the gentle creaking of the great, oaken timbers of the hull, a sound like a deep and rhythmic breath. There is the soft snap and flutter of the great, canvas sails as the wind catches them. And there is the constant, gentle lapping of the water against the sides of the ship. The air is thick with the smells of the sea, the sharp, clean scent of salt and the damp, earthy smell of the harbor, all mixed with the pungent and strangely comforting aroma of the hot tar that was used to seal the ship's planks and the rough, natural scent of the hempen ropes. As you walk across the main deck, you are surrounded by a complex and beautiful web of rigging, a great, intricate network of ropes and of pulleys that stretches from the deck all the way up to the tops of the great wooden masts. Each of these ropes has a name and a specific purpose, and the sailors move among them with a practiced and almost intuitive ease, their bare feet sure on the wooden planks. At the stern of the ship is the great tiller, the long, wooden arm that controls the ship's rudder, and it is here that the captain and his navigator will stand for countless hours, their eyes fixed on the compass and on the stars, guiding their small, wooden world across the vast and empty sea. And what of the world below deck? As you descend the narrow ladder, you enter a different world, a world of shadows and of cramped, close quarters. The air down here is thick with the smell of old wood, of bilge water, and of the hundreds of barrels of food and of water that are carefully stowed in the ship's hold. The only light comes from a few, small, swaying lanterns, which cast long and dancing shadows on the curved timbers of the hull. This is where the crew will live for months, and perhaps even years, on end. Their sleeping quarters are simple hammocks, strung up wherever there is space, and their meals are simple and repetitive, consisting mainly of salted meat, hard biscuit, and a ration of wine or of water. This small, dark, and constantly moving space would be their entire world, a world of wood and of rope, a fragile bubble of civilization carrying the hopes, the fears, and the dreams of an entire age, a small and lonely star about to set sail on a vast and unknown ocean of its own. The fortunes of the struggling and desperate Jamestown colony, which had for so long been hanging by a single, fragile thread, were about to change dramatically and forever with the introduction of a single, highly profitable, and dangerously seductive plant, tobacco. In the year 1612, an English settler named John Rolfe, a man whose name would become forever linked with the colony's great economic success, and also with its deepest moral contradictions, managed to successfully cultivate a new and much sweeter strain of tobacco using seeds that he had somehow acquired from the Caribbean. This particular strain of tobacco was far more palatable to European tastes than the harsh and bitter native Virginia tobacco, and it quickly became a sensation, a highly sought-after and incredibly fashionable commodity back in the smoky taverns and the grand drawing rooms of England and all across the continent. This golden leaf, as it came to be known, would become the very economic backbone of the Virginia colony, transforming it almost overnight from a starving, failing, and desperate outpost into a profitable and thriving commercial venture. But what was the true cost of this new and sudden prosperity? The cultivation of tobacco is an incredibly labor-intensive and land-hungry process, and the immense success of the crop created a sudden and almost insatiable demand for a large and cheap labor force. To meet this need, the colony initially relied heavily on a system of indentured servitude. What did this mean? Imagine the desperate and hopeful faces of the thousands of poor and landless individuals back in England. They would agree to sign a contract, an indenture, to work for a set number of years, typically 4 to 7, in the tobacco fields of Virginia. In exchange for their labor, they would be given their passage to America, a place of new beginnings, and, most importantly, the promise of land and of freedom once their term of service was finally complete. For a time, this system helped to populate the colony and to clear the vast tracts of land that were needed for the ever-expanding tobacco plantations. However, as the high mortality rate in the colony began to improve and as more and more of these indentured servants completed their terms and claimed their freedom, the wealthy planters of Virginia faced a growing and urgent problem. They needed a more permanent and a more easily controlled labor force to work their immensely profitable fields. And so, in the year 1619, a year of profound and lasting significance in American history, two fateful and deeply contradictory events occurred in the Jamestown colony. First, a Dutch ship arrived in the harbor, bringing with it the first African laborers to the English colonies. This single, quiet event marked the very beginning of a long, dark, and brutal chapter in American history, the chapter of African slavery. While these first Africans may have initially been treated as indentured servants, with the possibility of one day earning their freedom, the labor system in Virginia began to rapidly and inexorably shift towards a reliance on chattel slavery. By the late 1600s, this brutal system had become fully and legally institutionalized, with a series of harsh and unforgiving new laws that codified the status of enslaved people as property, a condition that would be passed down from mother to child for generations to come. The transatlantic slave trade, which would bring hundreds of thousands of Africans to the colonies against their will, a journey of almost unimaginable horror, became a fundamental and tragic part of the Southern economy. The incredible wealth of the great tobacco plantations was now being built directly on the broken backs and the stolen lives of enslaved people. But what was the other great event of 1619? In that very same year, the Jamestown colony became the site of the very first representative government in all of North America, with the establishment of the House of Burgesses. This new legislative assembly allowed the English settlers to elect their own representatives, who could then gather together to make decisions and to pass laws on behalf of the entire colony. It was a remarkable and revolutionary first step towards self-governance. And here we find the great and troubling paradox at the very heart of the American story. In the very same year, in the very same place, the seeds of slavery and the seeds of democracy were planted in the very same soil. How could a place that was beginning to whisper of liberty and of self-governance also be laying the foundations for centuries of bondage? This is a contradiction that would haunt the nation for its entire history. Meanwhile, the relationship between the Jamestown settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy remained tense and often violent. While figures like the famous Pocahontas, who married John Rolfe in 1614, helped to foster a brief period of peace and harmony between the two cultures, the underlying conflicts over land and resources continued to simmer. The ever-expanding tobacco plantations required more and more land, which inevitably led to the English encroaching further and further into the ancestral territories of the Powhatan people. And in the year 1622, after years of this growing pressure, the Powhatan, under the leadership of their new chief, Opechancanough, launched a major and devastating surprise attack against the English settlements, killing nearly a quarter of the entire colony's population in a single day. This event marked a major turning point, leading to increased hostility and a series of brutal wars that would eventually result in the subjugation and the tragic displacement of the Powhatan people from their lands. The Jamestown colony also faced its own internal struggles. Corruption within the Virginia Company back in London and poor management in the colony itself often hampered its progress. Finally, in the year 1624, after hearing of the high mortality rates and the constant turmoil, King James I revoked the company's charter, making Virginia a royal colony, now under the direct and firm control of the English crown. This shift brought a greater degree of stability to the colony, but also a much tighter oversight from the mother country. Despite all of its early struggles, the Jamestown settlement had now laid the foundation for the English colonization of North America. It had become a symbol of perseverance and of adaptability, demonstrating that a European society could, in fact, survive and even thrive in the New World. It had also, tragically, established the economic and social models, the great plantation economy fueled by a single cash crop and a deep and tragic reliance on enslaved labor, that would come to define the southern colonies for centuries to come. The legacy of Jamestown is, therefore, a deeply and profoundly complex one, a story of incredible achievement and of deep and lasting injustice, a story that would profoundly shape the future of America. As the last, faint, familiar smudge of their homeland disappeared below the western horizon, a new and profound reality began to settle upon the sailors of the Great Caravel. The world, which had for so long been a place of solid ground, of familiar sounds, and of the comforting presence of a large community, was now reduced to the simple and stark elements of wood, of water, and of sky. They were now truly and completely alone, a tiny, floating world adrift in an immense and seemingly endless ocean. The initial excitement and the nervous energy of the great departure now gave way to the long, slow, and repetitive rhythm of life at sea, a rhythm that would come to define their entire existence for the many long months, and perhaps even years, that lay ahead. Life aboard the ship was governed by the steady and unchanging toll of the ship's bell, which marked the passing of the 4-hour watches. The crew was divided into 2 watches, the port and the starboard, and their lives were a constant and repeating cycle of work, of rest, and of quiet, patient waiting. Can you picture it? The sound of the bell echoes across the deck in the pre-dawn darkness, its sharp, bronze tone cutting through the sound of the wind and the waves, a signal for one watch to tumble from their warm, swaying hammocks and to relieve their weary comrades who have stood on deck through the long and lonely night. There was always work to be done. A great sailing ship is a living, breathing thing, a complex and beautiful machine of wood and of rope that requires constant and meticulous attention to keep it alive. The sailors would spend their long hours trimming the great, heavy canvas sails to catch every last breath of wind, their hands rough and calloused from the constant hauling on the thick, tarred ropes. They would scrub the wooden decks with salt water and sand to prevent the precious timbers from rotting in the constant damp. And they would sit for hours upon hours with a sailor's palm, a small leather tool, and a thick, waxed needle, patiently and methodically mending the great sails that were so often torn and frayed by the fierce and unrelenting ocean winds. It was a life of hard and often monotonous labor, a life that was dedicated to the single, all-encompassing purpose of keeping their small, wooden world moving forward, ever forward, into the unknown. And what of their life below deck? As you descend the narrow ladder into the heart of the ship, you enter a different world, a world of deep shadows and of cramped, close quarters. The air down here is thick with the smell of old, damp wood, of stale bilge water, and of the hundreds of barrels of food and of water that are carefully and tightly stowed in the ship's hold. The only light comes from a few, small, swaying lanterns, which cast long and dancing shadows on the great, curved timbers of the ship's hull. This is where the crew will live for months, and perhaps even years, on end. Their sleeping quarters are simple hammocks, strung up wherever there is space, and their meals are simple and repetitive, consisting mainly of hardtack, a rock-hard biscuit that was designed to last for years without spoiling, of salted beef or pork, so tough and so salty that it had to be soaked for hours in water before it could be even remotely edible, and of a carefully and strictly rationed supply of stale water and sour wine. But in the quiet moments of the voyage, in the calm of the evening dog watch, the ship would come alive with a different kind of energy. The sailors, their day's hard work now done, would gather together on the foredeck, their faces illuminated by the soft, yellow light of a single lantern. And they would share stories, they would sing the old, sad songs of their distant homeland, and they would find a deep and powerful sense of companionship in their shared experience. In this small and completely isolated world, far from all the comforts and the certainties of home, the bonds that were forged between these men, these brothers of the sea, were often stronger and deeper than any they had ever known on land. But the long and seemingly endless days on the open ocean were not without their own moments of sudden and breathtaking wonder. Imagine the pure and unadulterated joy of the sailors as they witness a great school of dolphins, their sleek, gray bodies leaping and playing in the bow wave of the ship, a beautiful and welcome escort on their lonely journey, a reminder that they were not entirely alone in this vast, blue world. Or imagine the sense of profound and quiet awe as they watch a great whale, a creature larger than their ship itself, slowly and gracefully breach the surface of the water, its great, dark, and ancient eye seeming to look directly into their very souls before it disappears back into the silent and mysterious depths. And at night, far from the distracting lights of any city, the sea itself would sometimes come alive with a strange and magical light. A soft, ethereal glow, a phenomenon we now know as bioluminescence, would illuminate the wake of the ship, the water sparkling with millions upon millions of tiny points of light, as if the very stars of the heavens had fallen into the sea. These were the moments of magic, the moments of wonder, that would break the long and grueling monotony of the voyage and would remind the sailors of the incredible and mysterious beauty of the world they were exploring. But there were also the long days of quiet desperation, the immense psychological toll of the unending emptiness of the great ocean. There were the days of homesickness, when a sailor's heart would ache with a deep and profound longing for the familiar faces and the simple comforts of the life he had left behind. There was the constant, gnawing fear of the unknown, the fear of the great sea monsters that were said to lurk in the depths, and the very real and ever-present fear of the great storms that could, at any moment, rise up from the horizon and swallow their small and fragile ship whole. This long and rhythmic life at sea was a kind of powerful and profound meditation, a process that stripped away all the non-essential things of the world and left only the fundamental elements of existence, the hard work of survival, the deep and abiding need for companionship, and the vast, silent, and beautiful emptiness of the great ocean and the quiet, distant, lonely stars that would now be their only guide. On the great and open ocean, far from the sight of any land, the world becomes a place of profound and beautiful simplicity. There is only the deep, dark blue of the sea below, and the vast, endless bowl of the sky above. For the sailors on the small caravel, their ship a tiny and insignificant speck in this immense emptiness, the greatest and most constant challenge was a simple, terrifying question: where are we? In an age before the invention of GPS or of modern navigational tools, the art of finding one's way across the sea was a complex and beautiful science, a sacred and secret knowledge that was passed down from one generation of navigators to the next. It was an art that was based on a deep and intimate understanding of the great, predictable rhythms of the cosmos. Imagine the ship's navigator, a man of great learning and immense responsibility. He is the keeper of the ship's most precious and important tools. There is the magnetic compass, its small, quivering needle always pointing faithfully to the north, a magical and constant guide. There is the astrolabe, a beautiful and intricate brass instrument, a skeleton of the celestial sphere, that allows him to measure the height of the sun and the stars above the distant, perfect line of the horizon. And there are his charts, precious sheets of vellum that have been painstakingly drawn by hand, showing the coastlines of the known world and the great, rum lines of the winds and the currents. But his most important map is not on any piece of paper. It is the great and magnificent map of the heavens themselves. In the northern hemisphere, the navigator's greatest and most trusted friend was a single, quiet star. This was Polaris, the North Star. Can you picture him on a clear and moonless night? The ship rocks gently on the long, slow swells of the ocean, the only sound the creaking of the timbers and the soft whisper of the wind in the sails. The navigator stands on the deck, his astrolabe in hand, and he searches the dark sky for the familiar and comforting shape of the great celestial bear, the constellation Ursa Major. And from there, his eyes follow the line of the two-pointer stars to the single, unmoving point of light around which all the other stars seem to slowly and gracefully turn. This is Polaris. And by carefully measuring the angle of this star above the horizon, he can know, with a remarkable and comforting precision, his latitude, his exact position north of the great, invisible line of the equator. The North Star was more than just a point of light, it was an anchor, a fixed and eternal point in a world of constant and unpredictable motion. But what about their position east or west? This was the great and far more difficult challenge of ancient navigation, the famous longitude problem. To know your longitude, you need to know the time, not just the time on your ship, but the exact time at your home port. And in an age before the invention of accurate and reliable clocks that could withstand the constant motion of a ship at sea, this was an almost impossible task. And so, the navigator had to rely on a process called dead reckoning. He would carefully measure the ship's speed through the water, often by throwing a simple log tied to a knotted rope over the side, and he would use his compass to keep track of its direction. From this, he could make an educated guess, a rough and often inaccurate estimation of how far east or west he had traveled. This constant uncertainty, this gnawing sense of not quite knowing where you were, was one of the greatest psychological challenges of the long ocean voyages. And as the great caravel sailed further and further south, a new and deeply disorienting challenge presented itself. One night, the sailors would look to the northern sky and they would find that their old and trusted friend, Polaris, the North Star, had vanished. It had sunk below the horizon, and they were now in a new and unfamiliar sea, under a new and unfamiliar sky. Imagine the sense of profound and unsettling loss. The single, constant point that had for so long guided them was now gone. They were now truly in the unknown. But as they sailed deeper into the southern hemisphere, they began to learn to read the new and beautiful constellations of the southern sky. They discovered the magnificent Southern Cross, a brilliant and beautiful constellation that would become their new and trusted guide, its long axis pointing always towards the south celestial pole. And so, the sailors of the Great Caravel placed their faith not in the shifting and unpredictable waves of the sea, but in the constant and eternal and beautiful movements of the heavens. They learned to see the sky as a great and perfect clock, a magnificent and divine map that had been created by the hand of God to guide them on their long and lonely journey. The lonely stars were their guides, their companions, and their hope, quiet and beautiful whispers of light in the immense and silent darkness of the great, open ocean. For weeks, the Great Caravel had sailed southward, propelled by the steady and reliable trade winds. The sailors had grown accustomed to the rhythmic creaking of the ship, to the constant, gentle hiss of the water along the hull, and to the beautiful, billowing curve of the great canvas sails against the deep blue sky. But as they approached the great, invisible line of the equator, a slow and unsettling change began to take place. The steady winds that had for so long been their constant companions began to falter, to weaken, and then, one morning, to die away completely. The great sails, which had for so long been full and alive with motion, now hung limp and lifeless from the masts. The ship, which had for weeks been moving with a sense of purpose and of progress, now lay still, becalmed on a sea that was as flat and as reflective as a great, polished mirror. They had entered the Doldrums. What is this strange and dreaded place? The Doldrums, or the Intertropical Convergence Zone as we now know it, is a belt of low pressure that encircles the Earth near the equator. It is a place where the great wind systems of the northern and the southern hemispheres meet and rise, creating a region of profound and often maddening calm, a place where the wind simply ceases to blow. For the sailors of the Great Caravel, this was a far more terrifying prospect than any storm. A storm, for all its violence, is an event, something that can be fought and survived. But this was a stillness, an emptiness, a profound and seemingly endless state of inaction that would test the very limits of their psychological endurance. The days began to blur into a single, monotonous, and oppressive reality. The sun beat down with a relentless and unforgiving intensity, its heat reflecting off the glassy surface of the sea, creating a shimmering and disorienting haze. The very air was thick, heavy, and humid, and the ship became a floating oven, its wooden planks hot to the touch. With no wind to cool them, the sailors' bodies were constantly slick with sweat, and the precious and carefully rationed supply of fresh water began to dwindle at an alarming rate. And as the days turned into weeks, a new and even more terrifying threat began to emerge from within their own bodies: scurvy. This terrible disease, which was caused by a lack of vitamin C, began to take its toll on the crew. Their gums would bleed, their joints would ache, and a deep and profound sense of weakness and of despair would begin to settle into their very bones. But the greatest test was a test of the soul. Can you imagine it? To be trapped in the same small, floating world, day after day, with no sign of change, no sense of progress, and no escape. The vast and empty ocean, which had once been a symbol of freedom and of possibility, now became a great, silent, and indifferent prison. The sailors would stare out at the unchanging horizon, their eyes searching desperately for the slightest ripple on the water, for the faintest whisper of a breeze. But day after day, there was nothing. A profound and dangerous sense of hopelessness began to creep through the ship. The men grew quiet and sullen, their old camaraderie replaced by a new and growing irritability. Tempers frayed in the oppressive heat, and small arguments could easily escalate into bitter and resentful silences. In this time of great and quiet crisis, it was the captain and his officers who had to hold the fragile world of the ship together. The captain, a man of immense and quiet strength, knew that the greatest danger was not the sea, but the despair that was growing in the hearts of his men. And so, he kept them busy. He ordered them to scrub the decks, to mend the sails, and to repair the rigging, even when there was no apparent need. He understood that the simple and repetitive rhythm of work, of shared and purposeful action, was the only thing that could keep the darkness of despair at bay. And in the long and quiet evenings, he would gather the crew together on the deck. He would tell them stories of other great voyages, of other great challenges that had been overcome. And he would remind them of their great purpose, of the new worlds that still lay just beyond the horizon, a quiet and constant reassurance that this great and terrible stillness would not last forever. And then, one morning, after what seemed like an eternity of waiting, a single sailor, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, saw something. It was a small, dark line on the water, a gentle and almost imperceptible ripple. And then another. And then, a soft and gentle breath of wind, a cool and beautiful caress on their hot and tired skin. A great and joyous shout went up from the deck. The Doldrums had broken. The wind, their old and trusted friend, had finally returned. The sailors, their hearts now filled with a new and profound sense of hope and of gratitude, scrambled to the ropes, their movements now quick and alive with purpose. The great sails, which had for so long hung limp and lifeless, now began to fill with the new breeze, and the ship, their small and resilient world, once again began to move forward, its prow pointing towards the great and still unknown south. They had been tested by the silence, by the emptiness, and by their own despair, and they had, through their endurance and their shared hope, survived. They had passed through the great and terrible trial of the soul, and they were now ready for whatever new wonders, and whatever new challenges, the great Southern Ocean had in store for them. After what seemed like an eternity of agonizing stillness in the oppressive heat of the Doldrums, the return of the wind was like a great and beautiful miracle. A new sense of hope and of purpose now filled the small, wooden world of the caravel. The sailors, their faces still gaunt from their long ordeal, now moved with a new and determined energy, their hands sure on the ropes as they trimmed the great sails to catch every precious breath of the new breeze. But their relief was tempered by a new and growing anxiety. Their long delay in the calm of the equator had taken a terrible toll on their supplies. The barrels of fresh water were now dangerously low, the hardtack biscuits were infested with weevils, and the specter of scurvy still haunted the ship's dark and crowded quarters. They knew, with a deep and certain clarity, that they needed to find land, and they needed to find it soon. The days turned into weeks, and still, there was nothing but the endless, empty expanse of the great, blue ocean. And then, one morning, a sailor who was on watch high up in the crow's nest, his eyes scanning the horizon as he had done 1,000 times before, saw something. It was not land, not yet. It was a single, green branch, floating on the gentle waves, a small and beautiful sign of life, a promise from a world that they had begun to fear they would never see again. A great and hopeful shout went up from the deck. And in the days that followed, other signs began to appear. A tropical seabird, its wings catching the morning light, circled their ship, its strange and beautiful call a sound that was completely alien to their European ears. And then, finally, the moment they had all been praying for arrived. The lookout, his voice hoarse with a mixture of disbelief and of pure, unadulterated joy, let out the great and legendary cry, "Land ho!" Every man on the ship rushed to the rail, their eyes straining to see what he had seen. And there it was, on the distant horizon. At first, it was just a faint, dark line, a smudge between the blue of the sea and the blue of the sky. But as their small ship sailed closer, this smudge began to grow, to take on shape and color. It was an island, a jewel of the most vibrant and breathtaking green, its high, volcanic peaks shrouded in a soft, white mist, its shores lined with beautiful, white sand beaches and groves of strange and graceful palm trees. A great and spontaneous cheer erupted from the sailors, a sound of pure and profound relief, some men laughing, others crying, their long and difficult ordeal finally at an end. As the caravel made its slow and cautious approach to this new and unknown land, the sailors were filled with a sense of immense wonder. The air itself was different here, thick with the sweet and intoxicating scent of strange new flowers and of ripe, exotic fruit. The sound of the island was a great and vibrant symphony, a chorus of strange and beautiful birdsong that was unlike anything they had ever heard before. This was a new world, a true paradise, a place that seemed to have been untouched by the hand of man. But as they sailed closer, they saw that they were not alone. From the shore, a series of long and elegant canoes, each one carved from a single great tree, began to paddle out to meet them. And in these canoes were a people whose skin was the color of warm, polished copper, their bodies adorned with intricate tattoos and beautiful ornaments of shell and of bone. This was the great and solemn moment of first contact. Imagine the scene from the perspective of the islanders. They had lived on their beautiful and secluded island for countless generations, their world defined by the sea and by the jungle. And now, suddenly, a great and strange, floating house, with vast, white wings, had appeared on their horizon, a visitor from another world. Their initial fear soon gave way to a deep and powerful curiosity. And on the beach, a quiet and cautious meeting took place. The captain of the caravel, his face a mixture of wonder and of apprehension, offered a simple gift, a small, polished steel mirror. An island elder, his face a beautiful and intricate map of a long and peaceful life, accepted the gift and, in return, offered the sailors a basket of fresh, sweet fruit and gourds filled with cool, clean water. There were no shared words, no common language, but in this simple and silent exchange of gifts, a new and fragile bridge was being built between two completely different worlds. For several days, the sailors rested on the shores of this beautiful island, their bodies recovering from their long and arduous journey, their spirits revived by the abundance of fresh food and clean water. They engaged in a quiet and respectful trade with the islanders, exchanging simple European goods for the knowledge they so desperately needed, the knowledge of this new and strange and beautiful world. And then, with their ship reprovisioned and their bodies and their souls restored, the time came for them to leave. As the caravel once again raised its great, white sails, the sailors looked back at the small, green island, a beautiful and fleeting paradise that had given them a brief and welcome respite on their long and lonely journey. They had found a new world, a confirmation that the great ocean was not empty. But their own world was still on the other side of the great ocean. The lonely stars were calling to them once more, beckoning them ever onward, into the heart of the vast and still unknown Pacific. After leaving the warm and gentle shores of the tropical island, a fleeting paradise that now seemed like a distant and beautiful dream, the great caravel once again turned its prow southward, sailing into a new and unfamiliar sea. The air, which had for so long been warm and soft, now grew colder, and it began to carry a new and sharp, metallic bite. The sky, which had been a brilliant and cloudless blue, now took on a hard, gray, and unforgiving sheen. And the sea itself, the great and powerful ocean, seemed to change its very character, its gentle, rolling swells replaced by a new and powerful choppiness, its deep, sapphire blue giving way to a cold and menacing dark gray. The sailors, who had for so long been accustomed to the warm and predictable trade winds of the tropics, now found themselves battling fierce and unpredictable winds that seemed to come from all directions at once. They were entering the high southern latitudes, the great and treacherous waters that led to the very bottom of the world, a place known to all sailors in hushed and fearful tones as the graveyard of ships. Their goal was to find a passage, a strait, a way around the great and unknown southern continent that would allow them to finally, at long last, turn for home. As they sailed further and further south, the world around them became a landscape of profound and desolate, yet strangely beautiful, grandeur. Great, strange seabirds, like the magnificent, lonely albatross, their immense wingspans wider than a man is tall, now followed their ship, gliding effortlessly on the powerful and constant winds. And in the cold, dark water, the sailors began to see great, ghostly shapes, massive islands of pale, blue-white ice that had broken off from the great, frozen continent of the south and were now drifting northward on the powerful currents. The very air was now so cold that ice began to form in the thick, tarred rigging of the ship, and the sailors' hands, rough and calloused as they were, grew numb and clumsy as they hauled on the frozen ropes. The psychological toll of this new, harsh, and alien environment was immense. The sun was now a weak and distant thing, a pale, watery disk that seemed to provide no warmth at all. And the long, dark nights were filled with a deep and unsettling cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. The sailors, who had found such easy camaraderie in the warmth of the tropics, now grew more quiet, more introspective, their faces grim and serious as they faced this new and elemental challenge. They were now entering the realm of the roaring 40s, and the furious 50s, the latitudes where the great westerly winds circle the entire globe, unimpeded by any landmass, creating some of the most consistently violent and dangerous seas on the entire planet. The great ship, which had once seemed so sturdy and so reliable, now felt like a small and fragile toy, a piece of driftwood that was being tossed about by the immense and completely indifferent power of the great southern ocean. The waves were like moving mountains, their great, gray, angry peaks towering over the small caravel before crashing down upon its deck in a great and thunderous torrent of cold and heavy water. The wind screamed and howled through the rigging with a sound like 1,000 angry spirits, a constant and deafening roar that made it almost impossible to hear the desperate shouts of the officers. In this time of great and constant peril, the captain and his crew were tested to their absolute limits. The captain, his face now a mask of sea salt and of profound weariness, seemed to never sleep. He stood at the great tiller for hours on end, his hands raw and bleeding from the constant struggle, fighting to keep the ship's head into the great waves, knowing that a single moment of inattention, a single mistake, could mean the end for them all. The sailors, working in the freezing cold and the constant, drenching spray, fought to keep the great sails trimmed, to keep the ship afloat, and to keep their own deep fear at bay. This was not a battle against another army, against another human foe. This was a battle against nature itself, a battle against the raw, untamed, and unforgiving power of the planet. And then, after weeks of this constant and exhausting struggle, they finally found it, a narrow and treacherous passage of water, a strait that cut through the great, dark, rocky islands at the very tip of the southern continent. This was the passage that would one day bear the name of a later, more famous navigator, Magellan. But for these first sailors, it was simply the gateway, the passage from one great and terrible ocean to another, the final and most dangerous obstacle that stood between them and the long journey home. The journey through the strait was a nightmare of its own. The powerful winds howled through the narrow passage, creating strange and violent crosscurrents that threatened to smash their ship against the rocks. The great, jagged rocks that lined the channel seemed to reach out like the great, dark teeth of some monstrous sea serpent. But slowly, painstakingly, inch by agonizing inch, with every man on deck working as one, they made their way through. And then, finally, they were through. They had rounded the great and terrible southern cape. They had sailed around the very end of the world. As the ship finally entered the calmer waters of the great Atlantic Ocean and turned its prow northward, for the very first time in years, a profound and quiet sense of triumph filled the hearts of the weary crew. They had faced the Cape of Storms, the most feared and most dangerous stretch of water on the entire planet, and they had survived. The great ordeal was over. The long and difficult journey home had now truly begun, and the familiar and comforting sight of the North Star, their old and trusted friend, now lay waiting for them, just over the northern horizon. They had been tested by the sea, by the wind, and by their own deep fear, and they had emerged not just as survivors, but as true masters of the great and boundless ocean. After the great and terrifying ordeal of the Southern Cape, the calm and placid waters of the new ocean felt like a divine gift, a gentle and beautiful reward for their incredible endurance. The sailors, their bodies and their spirits battered by the relentless storms, now looked out upon a sea that was so peaceful and so vast that they named it the Pacific. The sky was a brilliant and cloudless blue, the wind was a gentle and steady breeze, and the ship moved with a new and easy grace, its great sails full and white against the horizon. A profound sense of hope and of relief filled the hearts of the weary crew. They believed that the worst was now behind them, that their long and difficult journey was finally nearing its end. They believed that the shores of the rich and fabled Spice Islands lay just a few weeks of easy sailing to the west. But they were tragically and completely wrong. The great ocean upon which they now sailed was far larger, far emptier, and far more challenging than any of them could have possibly imagined. The first few weeks on the Pacific were a time of quiet and hopeful recovery. The sailors mended their torn sails, they repaired the ship's rigging that had been damaged in the storms, and they enjoyed the simple and profound pleasure of sailing under a warm and gentle sun. But as the weeks turned into a month, and then two, a new and different kind of challenge began to emerge, a challenge that was not of the body, but of the soul. The vast and beautiful emptiness of the ocean began to work on their minds. Day after day, the scene was exactly the same, an endless, shimmering expanse of deep blue water, stretching to a perfect and unbroken horizon in every direction. The sun would rise in the east, it would arc across the great, empty sky, and it would set in the west, and nothing would change. The world had become a place of profound and almost terrifying monotony. The sailors' conversations grew more quiet, their songs less frequent. A deep and gnawing sense of isolation began to settle over the small, wooden ship. They were adrift in a world that seemed to have no end, a world that was utterly devoid of any sign of life. But in the long and quiet nights, a new and different kind of world would reveal itself to them. Far from the obscuring lights of any human settlement, the night sky over the great Pacific Ocean was a spectacle of almost unimaginable beauty. The sailors would lie on the deck during the quiet night watch, their heads tilted back, and they would gaze up at a sky that was so filled with stars that it seemed as if the very heavens themselves were on fire. The great, luminous river of the Milky Way stretched from one horizon to the other, a shimmering and beautiful path of celestial light. And as they sailed further north, they began to see strange and new constellations, beautiful and unfamiliar patterns of stars that no European had ever seen before. The lonely stars of this great southern sky became their only companions in the immense and silent darkness, a quiet and beautiful reminder that even in this great and terrible emptiness, there was still a sense of divine and perfect order. But the beauty of the night sky could not fill their empty stomachs. The long and unexpected journey across the Pacific was taking a terrible toll on their supplies. The hardtack biscuits were now riddled with weevils and had been reduced to a foul-tasting dust. The salted meat was rotting in its barrels, and the fresh water that remained was warm, stale, and green with algae. And with the lack of fresh food, the terrible and familiar scourge of scurvy once again began to creep through the ship. The sailors grew weak, their bodies aching, their old wounds reopening, their spirits slowly being crushed by the slow and quiet embrace of malnutrition and of disease. Each day, the lookout would climb to the top of the main mast, his eyes scanning the horizon with a desperate and fading hope, searching for the slightest sign of land. And each day, the call from above was the same: nothing. Nothing but the sea. The psychological strain of this long and seemingly endless voyage was immense. The men began to dream of home, of the simple and beautiful things they had left behind, the taste of fresh bread, the feel of solid ground beneath their feet, the sound of a loved one's voice. These memories, which had once been a source of comfort, now became a source of profound and painful longing. The great and boundless ocean, which had once seemed like a symbol of freedom and of adventure, now felt like a vast and beautiful prison. And then, after nearly 100 days of seeing nothing but the sea and the sky, just as the last vestiges of hope were beginning to fade, a sailor on watch saw something. It was a bird, a small, land-based bird, struggling against the wind far from any imaginable shore. And then another. And then, a floating piece of bamboo, a clear and undeniable sign of a nearby and unseen land. A new and desperate energy filled the ship. Every man who could still stand was now on deck, their eyes fixed on the western horizon. And as the sun began to set, they finally saw it. It was not a grand and mountainous island, but a small, low-lying atoll, a ring of green in the vast and empty blue. It was not the great Spice Islands they had been searching for, but it was land. It was salvation. The great and terrible ordeal of the Pacific was finally over. They had crossed the largest and most empty expanse of water on the entire planet, a feat of endurance and of navigation that was almost beyond belief. They were weary, they were sick, and they were starving, but they had survived. They were the first, and they had seen a world that no one had ever seen before. After their long and desperate crossing of the great Pacific Ocean, the surviving sailors of the expedition finally reached the shores of the islands that would one day become the Philippines. It was here that they were able to rest, to replenish their meager supplies, and to marvel at the rich and vibrant cultures they encountered. But it was also here, in these beautiful and exotic islands, that their great leader, Ferdinand Magellan, the man whose vision and whose iron will had carried them across the world, would meet his tragic and untimely end. Magellan became involved in a local conflict between two rival chieftains, and in a small and seemingly insignificant battle on the island of Mactan, he was killed. The Great Navigator, the man who had been the first to lead a voyage across the largest ocean on Earth, would not live to complete his own great journey around the world. With their captain now gone, the remaining crew faced a difficult and dangerous choice. They were thousands of miles from home, their ships were in poor repair, and they were now without their brilliant and charismatic leader. But the desire to complete their great voyage, to be the first to truly circumnavigate the globe, was a powerful and driving force. Under the new leadership of a man named Juan Sebastián Elcano, the sailors made the difficult decision to press on. They abandoned one of their 3 remaining ships, which was no longer seaworthy, and they continued their journey westward, their sights now set on the fabled Spice Islands. When they finally reached these islands, the Moluccas, they were met with a sight of incredible and almost unimaginable wealth. The air was thick with the sweet and pungent scent of cloves and of nutmeg, spices that were, at that time, worth more than their weight in gold back in Europe. They loaded their one remaining ship, the small and sturdy Victoria, with a precious cargo of these spices, a cargo that they hoped would be enough to pay for their entire, long, and costly expedition. But the most difficult part of their journey still lay ahead. To return to their home port in Spain, they had to sail across another vast and dangerous ocean, the Indian Ocean, and then they had to make the long and perilous journey around the continent of Africa. They were now in Portuguese-controlled waters, and they had to sail with the utmost stealth and caution to avoid being captured by their great rivals. The journey home was a long and grueling one. They faced more storms, more diseases, and the constant, gnawing threat of starvation. Many more sailors perished during this final, long leg of the voyage, their bodies committed to the deep, their dreams of returning home never to be realized. And then, finally, after 3 long and incredibly arduous years, on September 6, 1522, a single, battered, and ghost-like ship, its sails in tatters and its hull covered in the grime of 1,000 seas, limped into the harbor of Seville, Spain. This was the Victoria. Of the more than 270 men who had set out on 5 ships 3 years earlier, only 18 gaunt and weary survivors remained. They had been to the very ends of the earth and back again. They were the first humans to have ever circumnavigated the globe. What was the world that they returned to? And what was the world that they had left behind? The return of the Victoria and its small, weary crew was a moment of profound and world-changing significance. The precious cargo of spices they carried was more than enough to pay for the entire cost of the expedition and to make its investors incredibly wealthy. But the true and lasting treasure they brought back was not spices, it was knowledge. Their great voyage had proven, once and for all, that the world was round. It had revealed the true and immense scale of the Pacific Ocean, and it had forever changed humanity's understanding of the planet on which we live. The old maps, with their great sea monsters and their terrifying, unknown voids, were now obsolete. A new and much larger, much more complex, and much more wonderful world had been revealed. The great age of exploration, with all its courage, its cruelty, its triumphs, and its tragedies, had forged a new and globalized world, a world that was now, for the very first time, truly and completely interconnected. The lonely stars that had guided these first brave sailors across the great and empty oceans had also, in the end, guided humanity into a new and completely different age. The great age of exploration, that incredible period of human history that was defined by the courage of its sailors and the quiet guidance of the stars, has now come to a close. But its legacy, the profound and permanent changes it brought to the world, would endure for centuries, shaping the very course of all of human history and creating the complex, interconnected, and often troubled world that we inhabit today. The great voyages of these early navigators did more than just redraw the maps of our planet, they fundamentally and forever reshaped humanity's understanding of itself and of its place in the cosmos. What was the most immediate and profound legacy of this great age? It was the creation of the very first truly globalized world. For the first time in history, the great civilizations of the Eastern and the Western hemispheres were brought into direct and continuous contact with one another. This led to an immense and unprecedented exchange of goods, of ideas, of technologies, and of cultures, a great global mixing that has come to be known as the Columbian Exchange. From the Americas, new and revolutionary crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes were introduced to the Old World, where they would go on to transform the diets and the agriculture of Europe, Asia, and Africa, fueling a great and sustained global population growth. And in the other direction, horses, cattle, and wheat were introduced to the Americas, completely and forever altering the landscape and the way of life of the indigenous peoples. But this great exchange also had a much darker and more tragic side. The arrival of the Europeans in the Americas brought with it devastating new diseases to which the native populations had no immunity, leading to a catastrophic demographic collapse. And the age of exploration also gave rise to the great and brutal era of European colonialism, as nations like Spain, Portugal, England, and France established vast and powerful empires in the New World. This period of conquest and of colonization had devastating and lasting consequences for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, leading to the destruction of their great civilizations, the loss of their ancestral lands, and centuries of exploitation and oppression. The age of exploration also had a profound and lasting impact on the world of science. The great voyages of discovery completely and utterly shattered the old, medieval worldview. The circumnavigation of the globe by Magellan's crew provided the final, irrefutable proof that the world was round, confirming the theories of the ancient Greek astronomers. The discovery of new continents and new peoples forced the scholars of Europe to completely reconsider their understanding of geography, of biology, and of human diversity. This great flood of new information, of new plants, of new animals, and of new cultures, sparked a new and powerful wave of scientific curiosity and inquiry, a desire to understand and to categorize the incredible diversity of the world, a curiosity that would directly lead to the great scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries. And what of the lonely stars themselves, the quiet and constant companions that had guided these brave sailors across the great and empty oceans? The art of celestial navigation, which was perfected during the age of exploration, represented a profound and beautiful intersection of science, of mathematics, and of a deep and almost spiritual connection to the cosmos. The ability to find one's way across a featureless ocean by looking at the heavens was more than just a practical skill, it was a powerful and humbling reminder of humanity's small and fragile place in a vast and ordered universe. The lonely stars were a symbol of constancy in a world of change, a symbol of hope in the face of the great unknown, and a symbol of the incredible power of the human mind to understand and to navigate the great mysteries of the cosmos. And so, as we reflect on this great and transformative era, we are left with a complex and often contradictory legacy. It was an age of incredible courage and of breathtaking discovery, but it was also an age of immense cruelty and of profound and lasting injustice. It was an age that connected our world in ways that had never been possible before, but it also created new and powerful systems of global inequality that continue to shape our world to this very day. The story of the Great Navigators is a powerful and enduring testament to the boundless and often contradictory nature of the human spirit itself, our incredible capacity for both great and noble discovery, and for great and terrible destruction. And with that final thought, our long and quiet journey into the age of exploration, the age of the lonely stars, comes to its end. From the first, tentative voyages into the sea of darkness to the great circumnavigations that revealed a new and global world, it has been an epic saga of immense courage, of profound transformation, and of enduring consequences. Now, let the echoes of the creaking timbers, the snap of the great canvas sails, and the quiet whisper of the distant, lonely stars gently fade into the quiet of the night. It is time for history to rest, and it is time for you to rest as well. Good night, and have wondrous, adventurous dreams.